Chernobyl. What did the nuclear disaster do to this city? The first thing you notice is silence, not stillness. The birds are screaming loudly here, louder than in any city you've ever been. Because no city you've ever been has been empty for 39 years. But beneath the bird song, but beneath the wind, in the trees, beneath the distant mechanical click of a decimeter clipped to your jacket, there's an absence. There's an absence. So concrete that it has its own texture. No cars, no voices, no television from an open window. No child. At 5, Ukraine, 90 kilometers north of Kiev, 16 kilometers from the Belarusian border, 3 kilometers from the reactor that stopped everything. On April 25, 1986, the population at 5 was 40,360. By 2 p.m. on April 27, 36 hours after the explosion of reactor number 4, the population was 0. 1,300 buses arrived in a single column. Residents were told they would be gone for 3 days. They took documents, a change of clothes, food for the journey. They left dishes in the sinks, laundry on the lines, half-eaten cakes on the kitchen tables. Textbooks open on school desks. They left their apartments and never returned. No one returned. 3 days turned into 3 decades. 3 decades are still going on. The Chernobyl exclusion zone covers approximately 20 and 600 square kilometers in northern Ukraine. An area roughly the size of Luxembourg, closed off by checkpoints where only those with passes and dosimeters are allowed in, and with the understanding that the ground you walk on and the dust you breathe may contain half-lives measured in centuries. Cesium-137, 30 years. Strontium-90, 29 years. Plutonium-239, 24,000 years old. There are 2 checkpoints. At the 30-kilometer perimeter, a guard checks passports and passes. At the 10-kilometer perimeter, the procedure is repeated. Between them, the road passes through a forest so dense and still that its desolation is only realized after a few kilometers. More than 100 villages hide there. Evacuated, abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. The forest has had almost 4 decades to close in around them. The dosimeter reads 0.12 microsieverts per hour on the road. It won't stay there. The land. The Chernobyl region is located on the Polizzi lowland, a flat, marshy plain of forests and wetlands stretching across northern Ukraine and southern Belarus with Pripyat River Basin. The soil is sandy, the groundwater level is high. The landscape is one of birch and pine forests, alder swamps and peat bogs, interspersed with clearings of former collective farms where potatoes, flax, and rye were grown. Construction of the plant began here in 1917 because the site met the requirements: level terrain, a large river, for cooling, proximity to the power grid, and in sufficient distance from Kyiv. Regulations dictated a minimum distance of permitting of 25 kilometers from a major city. Plant was built approximately 100 kilometers away. This was considered more than sufficient. Pripyat was deliberately designed as Atomgrad, a city for nuclear workers built simultaneously with the plant dus below site workers. By Soviet standards, it was an exceptionally good place to live. The apartments were newer than the national average. There was a swimming pool, a sports complex, and an amusement park, the opening of which was scheduled for May 1986, 5 days after the explosion. The Ferris wheel, erected for the opening and never used, still stands in the central square. The yellow gondolas have faded to the color of old paper, and the trees that have grown around it are already taller than the wheel itself. The reactor that failed was an RBMK-1000, a Soviet design with a history of instability at low power levels, which the safety culture of the Soviet nuclear program never fully eliminated. At 1:20 a.m. on April 26, 1986, during a safety systems test, the reactor's power suddenly increased to approximately 100 times its maximum in less than 5 seconds to show. The ensuing explosion blew off the reactor's 2,000-ton seal, exposing the core to the atmosphere and sparking a graphite fire. It burned for 10 days, spreading radioactive material across Belarus, Ukraine, Scandinavia, and measurable quantities across much of the northern hemisphere. The contamination fell in an irregular, unpredictable pattern. Two villages separated by 3 kilometers could differ in cesium-137 levels by a factor of 10. This was the basis for every subsequent decision. Evacuation boundaries. Liquidation priorities, and medical monitoring were all calculated under conditions of uncertainty that existing science struggled to cope with. In 2016, a new safe shelter at 36,000-ton steel arch, the Aha-E, largest movable structure ever built, was slid over the old sarcophagus. Inside, the remains of the reactor rest in darkness, still emitting radiation, still generating heat, still undergoing processes that will continue for the night of the explosion. To understand what Chernobyl did to this place, one must understand what happened in the hours following the explosion in April 1986. And hours that determined everything that happened afterward. The operators in the control room of Reactor 4 did not immediately understand what had happened. The instruments they relied on weren't designed to register what had happened because what had happened wasn't considered possible. The RBMK reactor had a theoretically worst-case scenario. Reality exceeded it so much that sensors simply failed, went off scale, froze, or produced readings that operators interpreted as instrument malfunctions because the alternative, the core destroyed, wasn't what training had prepared them for. Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, reportedly believed for several hours after the explosion that the reactor was intact and that the accident could be contained by flooding the area with water. He ordered the operators to continue pumping water into the reactor, which no longer existed. The water splashed onto exposed fuel and turned into radioactive steam. Akimov and his crew worked all night under extreme radiation exposure. He died in a Moscow hospital on May 11, 16 days later. Firefighters arrived within minutes. They climbed to the roof of Reactor 3. Firefighters rushed from the fourth building adjacent to the destroyed one to extinguish fires caused by burning graphite fragments injected by the explosion. They wore standard firefighting gear. They had no dosimeter. They had no information about the nature of the fire. The graphite debris on the roof emitted thousands of roentgens per hour, a dose capable of killing in minutes. Of the approximately 130 emergency workers who received the highest doses, 28 died within 4 months. Many died from acute radiation syndrome, a condition in which radiation damages the gastrointestinal tract lining and bone marrow of marrow simultaneously, causing a death. Medical personnel who witnessed it described as one of the most difficult experiences of their lives. Residents 3 kilometers away were not informed. The explosion occurred at 1:23 a.m. on the Free-Hand line of April 26. Children went to school. Workers went on shift. Wedding season had begun, and couples were taking photos in city parks. Meanwhile, 3 kilometers downwind, graphite spewed millions of curies of radioactive iodine, cesium, and tritium into the air above them. The order to evacuate came 36 hours later. 1,400 buses requisitioned from Kyiv and the surrounding APO-40 arrived in a column that residents later described as the longest line of transport they had ever seen. An announcement over the city public address system urged people to prepare for a temporary evacuation for 3 days. Many left their pets behind, expecting to return. Petya allegedly had several thousand dogs and cats. The aftermath was dealt with by Soviet army units tasked with preventing them from leaving the contaminated area. The decision to delay the evacuation for 36 hours remains one of the most discussed aspects of the disaster. The delay was partly bureaucratic. The decision required Moscow's approval. Moscow demanded confirmation of what had happened, and the confirmation was delayed by the same institutional reluctance to acknowledge the scale of the failure among that had contributed to the failure itself. This was partly radiological. Initial measurements indicated that contamination in Pripyat, although elevated, did not pose an immediate threat to life. This assessment, which turned out to be accurate within narrow medical limits, exposed the population to thyroid-damaging doses of radioactive iodine, which in the following decades caused a measurable increase in thyroid cancer. Iodine posed the most immediate biological threats, especially in children. Radioactive iodine-131 has a half-life of only 8 days and decays quickly, but during these 8 days it concentrates in the thyroid gland with a selectivity that makes it disproportionately dangerous to the organ that absorbs it. Children's thyroid glands are smaller and more active than those of adults. Children absorb proportionally more iodine gram of thyroid tissue. The surge in childhood thyroid cancer that emerged in Belarus and Ukraine in the early 1990s, 4 or 5 years after exposure, is directly and unequivocally linked to iodine released by the Chernobyl fire. Approximately 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer are attributed to the consequences of the disaster. Most were successfully treated, some were not. The loss of a village. The part of Chernobyl history that the world least photographed and that the zone's residents remember most. Within the 2,600 kilometer exclusion zone, there were more than 90 villages. They were not suburbs of Pripyat. They were agricultural communities. Some had existed for centuries, with wooden churches, collective farm buildings, hand-dug wells, and small garden plots that constituted the main source of food for a population of several dozen to several hundred people. The village of Kapachi, 4 kilometers from the reactor, wasn't simply evacuated, it was buried. The contamination of the wooden surfaces of the village buildings was so severe that it was decided to demolish the entire village and bury it. Bulldozers pushed the houses into their basements and covered them with a meter of clean soil. Today, Kapachi is a field of low earthen mounds, each marked with a yellow triangular radiation hazard sign. The mounds are houses. The radiation signs are gravestones. The village exists as a topographical record of its own destruction. Other villages were simply locked up and abandoned. Daltsaye, Lubyanka, Mashivo, Chernobyl 2. Their names appear on road signs pointing into the forest, where no road is visible. Some of the houses still stand, their roofs sagged under decades of foliage, their walls warped by the slow growth of trees through them, their interiors still holding furniture, curtains, and kitchen utensils. Abandoned by residents when buses arrived in the village of Parishev, the same one where Gana Zavorotnya lives. "14 houses out of the former 200 plus are occupied. The rest are empty or destroyed. The gardens of the empty houses have been swallowed by the forest. Fruit trees planted by families expecting a full harvest, still bear fruit, dropping uncollected apples onto the measurably contaminated ground, which the trees draw cesium, which becomes part of the falling fruit. This cemetery in Parishov is well kept. It is one of the most characteristic and most eloquent details of life in the zone. The returning squatters are almost all elderly. Their spouses, parents, and childhood friends are buried in these village cemeteries. The graves are maintained, the crosses are repainted, flowers are placed. On days designated for visiting cemeteries according to the Orthodox calendar, the Samozelst Bavi walk through the abandoned village to Bogost and stand among the graves in radioactive silence. Doing what people do in cemeteries everywhere, remembering, talking with the dead, and weeding the edges of the grave fences. The schools in these villages were smaller and more intimate than those in Pripyatsk. A single classroom might hold 15 children of varying ages. Taught by a single teacher. This teacher is also the most educated person in the village, and therefore an informal advisor on all matters, from land disputes to medical issues. The abandoned classrooms retain the same frozen-in-time character as the Pripyat schools, but on a scale that feels more intimate and therefore more poignant. A small pair of Kalish shoes by the door of the village school hurts more to behold than 100 gas masks on the gymnasium floor. But because the Kalish belonged to one child, and one child is as concrete as 100. No village dogs, no cats, no livestock. The birds haven't disappeared. They become more numerous than living memory. Wild boars have inhabited several villages, using abandoned buildings for shelter. A boar sleeping in a living room, the walls of which still bear the wallpaper image that Chernobyl regularly produces, and which the human mind has trouble classifying. It's simultaneously funny, sad, strange, and completely logical. Tension. The most unexpected consequence of the Chernobyl disaster. Wildlife is visible from any road inside the zone. Absent a human presence, no agriculture, hunting, pesticides, or construction, the exclusion zone has in 39 years been transformed into a de facto nature reserve covering 2,600 square kilometers. There are hundreds of wolves here. Their density is estimated to be 7 times higher than in the surrounding uncontaminated protected areas. The bison have multiplied. Lynxes have returned. Bears have been spotted. Przhevalsky's horses roam abandoned fields. Eagles are nesting. Research on abandoned buildings in Pripyat has found genetic damage in some species, increased mutation rates, and reduced reproductive success. in certain bird populations near the most contaminated sites. And yet populations are growing because the damage caused by radiation. For most species in most places in the zone is less severe than the damage caused by the human activities that radiation eliminated. Fields, roads, hunting, pesticides, fuel. Taken together, they were more harmful to wildlife than the nuclear disaster that removed them. This conclusion is uncomfortable. It doesn't mean radiation is beneficial. It means that what humans do to the landscape through settlement is cumulatively worse for most animals than what happened here. This is not a recommendation for nuclear accidents. It is an observation made possible by a single experiment that no one would have designed. The zone has also become a tourist attraction. In 2019, approximately 70,000 people visited. They come for photographs because of the HBO series that aired that year, which generated an influx of visitors that exceeded the zone's management capacity, with the abandoned city becoming one of most visually striking locations on Earth. Decades later, the disaster became a source of income for the region. Soil, it devastated. The Russian invasion in 2022 added another chapter. Russian troops occupied the Chernobyl site for 5 weeks, using it as a transit route to Kyiv. Soldiers dug trenches in the red forest, an area immediately west of the reactor where the radioactive fallout was most intense and where pine trees turned and died in the days following the explosion. According to reports, the troops received doses that then required medical attention. The occupation ended when Russian troops withdrew from northern Ukraine at the end of March 2022. The reactor was undamaged. The zone stood firm. Reflection on a spring evening. In Pripyat, the sun filters through the trees at an angle, illuminating the facades of residential buildings from below. At the same angle, presumably, as when people lived here and didn't think about the light. Because they were busy with dinner, lessons, weekend plans, everything that makes up life. When life is lived, not remembered. The city is not empty. It is full of trees. They have grown for 39 years without anyone trimming or guiding them. They have grown through the concrete of the central square. They have climbed up the stairwells of apartment buildings. They've exited through the windows of the upper floors. Their branches have reached into rooms. Where families once put their children to bed. In classroom number 3, a math textbook lies open on a desk. The child who sat at it, he survived, is now about 50 years old. He lives somewhere else, a different life. And he has children of his own. Who have never been in this classroom. The problem on the page remains unsolved. The pencil lies where it was placed. The light from the window. Filtered by 9 years of unplanned tree growth. Differs from the light that fell on the page. The last time it was read, the dosimeter reads 0.14 microsieverts at the hour. When you leave, the guard at the checkpoint scans your boots. The sensor beeps once on the left. Below the threshold is the decontamination deck. But enough to register. You bear the trace of this place. Everyone who comes here bears it. The forest grows behind you. Wolves hunting it tonight. The reactor inside its century-old steel sarcophagus. Still warm, and the city an obstacle awaits among the trees for what will not return.